And here we are at another reason why I wanted to do this retrospective, the Judgment games. Sorry for taking so long for this. I meant to get around before Infinite Wealth was released, but then that caught my attention, so hey, here it is now, your review for the Judgment games. This is a long time coming, I know. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if a new Judgment game is announced like right after I upload this, but whatever the case, here we are. Let's get into it. So once Kiryu had his time in the spotlight supposedly end in Yakuza 6 The Song of Life and Kiwami 2, Ryuga Gotoka would move to a new protagonist for their next game, that of course being Ken from Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise. God, I still need to finish this game. Afterwards, in December of 2018 in Japan and 2019 worldwide, Takayuki Yagami would grace the gaming world with his first game in the RGG lineup, Judgment, or Judge Eyes in Japan. So with this new premise of playing as a detective, exploring Kamurocho from the eyes of the law rather than a criminal, how much really changed in the switch to this new series? Honestly, shockingly little. Judgment is Yakuza in gameplay through and through, with a few extra elements thrown in and with a new protagonist to play as. If you've ever seen my VTuber streams, which I've also been getting back into, so maybe consider subscribing, the theme of being a paranormal detective was heavily inspired by Yagami, so it's no secret that I love these games. But before I get off track, let's get started with that plot. So the story in Judgment takes place in 2018, 3 years after the events of Yakuza 6, as after Kiryu's gone into hiding, Kamurocho's newest addition to the playable roster rears his head in the form of Takayuki Yagami, a former lawyer of the Genda law offices. After a murder trial in 2015 in which Yagami successfully acquitted Shenpei Okubo, a worker for the Advanced Drug Development Center, or ADDC, he's then arrested shortly after for the murder of his girlfriend. After being stricken with guilt, Yagami gives up his career as a lawyer and instead forms his own detective agency along with a former member of the Tojo clan, Masaharu Kaito. Anyway, after a series of new murders pop up all over Kamurocho, all revolving around the Yakuza and all of them having their eyes gouged out, Yagami decides to get involved with the Yakuza as he tries to solve the mystery of this mysterious new serial killer, one he dubs the Mole, as he seems to be able to pop up and disappear at any time. Very clever naming, Yagami. Very clever. The story in Judgment is one that's been done before. I mean, it's basically just a standard detective story, but never quite this way in the Yakuza series before. And no, I'm not counting Yakuza 4, as that mystery, quote-unquote, was solved in the first few hours. Judgment, meanwhile, keeps you hooked on the story until the very end and keeps throwing twists and turns at you, just practically begging you to move on to that next chapter and uncover what the hell just happened at the ending of the one before. Now, before I get ahead of myself, I want to mention that I played through both of the Judgment games in English, so if anyone's going to complain about that right now, then deal with it. Because I think the first Judgment, for having the first big English dub in the Yakuza series, aside from Fist of the North Star, since the first game on the PlayStation 2, was a massive breath of fresh air. Games having English dubs allow more people to enjoy a game, and Judgment has a few pretty well-known actors in the lead roles. Yagami is voiced by Greg Chun, probably most famous for his role in Squid Game, and he does a great job here. Kaito is voiced by Crispin Freeman, famous for his role as Alucard in the Hellsing anime, and here he comes across as another badass brute who takes no shit and dishes it out effectively. Even the supporting cast, such as Brian McNamara as Genda himself, all do a really good job. To top it all off, Kamurocho is as beautiful as ever, even with a decent chunk of the map kind of gone since being burned in Yakuza 6. Along with that, I'm playing the remastered version of the game, which basically makes the frame rate much more stable and also boosts it to 60 FPS. Unfortunately, there aren't any alternate cities in Judgment, but I guess to kind of mediate that, Kamurocho is packed with tons to do and new faces to meet, making it one of the most detailed depictions of the city in any game in the series. The music is pretty good as well, but unfortunately, just like in Yakuza 6, I can't really remember a lot of the music by heart. That's not to say it's bad, just not as memorable. The sound effects have seen a definite improvement though, and the combat hasn't felt this good in a Yakuza game since Kiwami 1. On that note, let's move on to the gameplay, which is easily one of the biggest improvements made in Judgment. For the first time since Kiwami 1, styles make a return, and this time we have two new styles to play with. Tiger's style is your basic fighting style in Judgment, and it's useful for most combat encounters that are limited to one or a few enemies, but when more than that get involved, that's when you swap to Crane style, which is a lot more suited for covering an area rather than one-on-one fights. Yagami is also a bit of an agile fellow, and using the power of his nimble form, he can jump off walls to get the advantage over enemies, either smashing them into the dirt or throwing them around for some pretty decent damage. There's a decent amount of heat actions, and given Yagami's increased agility, they all look way more flamboyant and flashy than anything since probably Majima in Yakuza 0, and even then, he can't really compare to a lot of these. Then there's the few times where you unlock a move or two that outright bend combat over and let you go to town, such as Flux Fissure for Tiger Style, or the returning Extreme Heat mode, which is arguably at its most broken stage ever here, and the amount of options here to dispatch the enemies here are pretty insane. Returning from Kiwami 2 are also the friends you can make throughout the town, and they might either join in the fight with you or throw you a weapon to help in combat, although there aren't any guns, which I guess makes sense as Yagami isn't a criminal, but he does end up beating the fuck out of people to the point of probably crippling them worse than a gunshot would. On that note, this is where I'm going to say that while Judgment is a fantastic game, there are a few things that don't gel well for me. For one, and I hate to say this for the third time in this retrospective, but block bouncing is unfortunately still a factor. Granted, I feel like it's at its least offensive point here given the aforementioned abundance of abilities and athletic acrobatics to assimilate assailants. Holy shit, this is why I suck at writing scripts, isn't it? There's also a feature in Judgment where if you're in a street fight for too long, eventually the cops will show up to break up the chaos, and I never liked this either. The worst mechanic in Judgment, though, by far, is mortal wounds. Basically, the way that this works is that if Yagami gets stabbed, shot, or hit with a super effective attack, your max health will drop below the point where you can heal it to full, and the only way to get it back is to either use a med kit, which aren't all that common to find, and are extremely expensive, or to run all the way to a specific corner of the map and see a doctor, but he also charges an arm and a leg, and to top it all off, the inventory space has been reduced by a significant amount, and money isn't that easy to come across early on in the story, so altogether, this mechanic just leads to a large amount of tiny problems. The point is that although I love the combat in Judgment a lot, it feels like there's just a few things that make it worse, and they shouldn't have been there. Also, this specific lockpicking minigame can absolutely go fuck itself. It never works properly. Also, and this is my last complaint, but it's a bit of a small one, but I need to point this out. Why is this game not on Xbox One? It's on PS4, PS5, PC, Series X, but it's not on Xbox One. It's even weirder considering every other game in the series is on that console too. That being said, for RGG's first attempt at introducing a new protagonist into the limelight in forever, this game did a great job of capturing a detective story while also maintaining the feel of Yakuza's combat. But you want to know what the best part is? Most of my complaints are fixed in Lost Judgment. And RGG took what was an already amazing game, and in my opinion, made it even better. Lost Judgment is basically a perfect sequel in every way. It takes the already solid foundation of the first Judgment and builds upon it, adding in tons of cool things and making the entire gameplay experience way better. Top that off with adding in a Jinsho to explore, and you've got a great time. But before I get into anything more, let's get into the story. Lost Judgment takes place in 2021, 2 years after the events in Yakuza Like a Dragon, and 3 years after the original Judgment. Having made a bit of a name for themselves in the last few years, the Yagami Detective Agency is about to meet their next big case when a police officer named Akihiro Ihara is accused of groping on a train. After being arrested, it turns out he's also linked to the murder of a teacher at Seiryo High School in a Jinsho named Hiro Mikoshiba, and blames both the courts and the school for doing nothing when his son, Toshiro, was driven to suicide by bullying at the school. With minimal leads and with the assistance of Yokohama 99, a new detective agency formed by Sugira and Tsukumo, Yagami must use his skills to figure out the motive behind these events, the history behind the school's apparent bullying problem, and also the involvement of a group of ex-Yakuza now under the Red Knife Clan, also known as RK. Lost Judgment has a lot of twists and turns in its story, and it kind of gets hard to follow at points, but not to the extent of something like Yakuza 4 or 5. Overall, though, the story, like the first Judgment, is well worth experiencing for just how hooked it gets you. Every single character in this game is so damn interesting, and it kind of had that Mass Effect 2 feeling for me, where even if I didn't enjoy the characters of the first game that much, when they make a return here, they're even better and more fleshed out, or just flat out more amusing and cool to be around. The story in here also gets really, really dark. I mean, the original game wasn't exactly a walk in the park with sunshine and flowers, but this game brings a lot of really sensitive subjects to the forefront, and in my opinion, I think it does it pretty well, actually. One of the other great things that I love, and I'm trying to say this without spoiling anything, is that the main villain is actually somebody who I can somewhat understand, as most of the other Yakuza villains didn't really have all that great a motivation behind them, but here, this is basically the first villain in a really long time where I can confidently say, I understand why you're doing what you're doing. I may not agree with it, but I understand it. As for the presentation, the Dragon Engine has produced yet another great-looking game to add to the lineup. I know I said that about pretty much every single game made on this engine, but good lord, I can't get enough of it. Combat animations are amazing, the heat actions all look fantastic, and Ijincho is just as fun to explore, especially now that Yagami has access to one of the coolest new additions to the game, a skateboard, allowing you to zip around at high speeds, or at least on the streets, as for some reason you can't skateboard on the goddamn sidewalks. The sound design is honestly up there as a top 5 in the series for me. Every combat theme sounds amazing, every sound effect of punches landing and kicks knocking teeth out is phenomenal, and even the little things like the sound effects of switching between Yagami's styles are also great. One thing as a side note though, why is it that the combat theme for the new Snake style called Green Vibes sounds eerily similar to Narrow Escape by Cell Dweller? I can't play too much because I don't want to risk getting a copyright claim, but just listen for a second. Tell me I'm not crazy about this one. Speaking of crazy, let's talk about the gameplay, because in my honest opinion, this is the best beat-em-up made in the Dragon Engine to date. For one thing, and I'm so happy to say this, block bouncing, as far as I can tell, has been completely removed, and that alone makes this the best feeling combat in this engine. I know Yakuza Kiwami 2 has its fans, and there's still a lot of people who defend the combat in the first couple of Dragon Engine games, but Lost Judgment basically takes that one major complaint I had in the previous game and does away with it entirely. On top of that, mortal wounds aren't a thing anymore, and have instead been replaced with the far better system of mortal reversals. How this works is that in combat, an enemy will charge up, leading to a devastating attack, but if you manage to dodge at just the right time, you can turn it back on the enemy by pressing the grab button and dish out a huge amount of damage. Cops have also been removed as a feature, so no more worrying about street fights going on too long, which is good, because you get to experience how much better Crane and Tiger feel in this game. Crane is still just as broken as ever, but with the exclusion of block bouncing, it feels a lot more effective, acting more like the crowd clearing style it was always meant to be, and it reminds me a bit of Breaker in Yakuza 0. EX Heat mode utterly destroys it, and that's just the way that I like it. Tiger style feels about the same as the original game, but it's had a few touch-ups to make it feel much more smooth, and of course the Tiger Drop and Flux Fissure both make a return, and you could theoretically get through the entire game with just these two styles, and they'd probably be enough to help Lost Judgment redeem the Dragon Engine combat in my eyes. Then you get access to Snake style, and all is forgiven. This style is focused a lot on parrying and judo tactics, kind of like Tanimura in Yakuza 4, but this runs circles around that bastard, as Snake is so much fun to use. I pretty much only used it during my initial playthrough, and I had so much fun with it. If you own the DLC, you also get access to a fourth style called Boxer style, and this is essentially if you gave Yagami Kuze's style of combat from Yakuza 0, and this is also a load of fun, but due to the return of the system for rewarding you more XP from more creative gameplay and nothing being rewarded for Boxer style, I never really used it unless I wanted to end a fight really quickly, because god damn is this style good at keeping enemies on the ground. While we're on that subject, why did it take so long to re-implement this feature? It encourages style and multiple playstyles to rack up that sweet experience points. Overall, Lost Judgment is just so much fun to play, and when you eventually unlock the skills and moves that expand Yagami's abilities, the game becomes some of the most fun I've ever had with hand-to-hand combat in any game. It rivals Yakuza 0 at times. Honestly, in some instances, I'd almost say it's better. However, there are a few things that hamper Lost Judgment for me, and unfortunately, most of them revolve around one particular thing: the high school itself. I think most of the missions in here, mostly revolving around the Mystery Club and some of the faculty, just fucking suck, and I think most of them are DLC, but good lord, the Motorcycle Club and the Robotics Club can go to hell and stay there, because I almost didn't even want to finish this entire side story because of that, and the reward you get isn't really worth it whatsoever. On top of that, I just don't like the location of the high school enough to hang around there unless I need to do missions, and it's a pain having to go back to the entrance every single time just to call a taxi since you can't do it from your smartphone because God is dead. But honestly, that's really my only complaint with Lost Judgment, and thankfully none of these issues exist in the Kaito Files DLC, which I can't not bring up. The Kaito Files is a story DLC pack where, as the name suggests, you play as Kaito a few months after the events of Lost Judgment. Yagami's out on a case, and Kaito suddenly thrust into a case of his own when he's suddenly tasked with finding an old flame of his named Mikiko, also coming across a teenager named June who claims to be their son. With a huge paycheck on the line and with the help of Higashi, Kaito battles a new faction of thugs by the name of Crimson Lotus to find out the mystery behind Mikiko's disappearance and if June really is his son. Without going into too much detail about this story, it is so unbelievably good, not only for character development for Kaito, but also just as a good detective story in general. You will laugh, you will cry, but you will mostly have fun. On that note, I'm not really going to be going into the presentation or sound design, as it's pretty much just as good as Lost Judgment. I want to get into straight what attracted me to this DLC, the gameplay. Kaito uses Brawler and Beast style from Zero and Kiwami, renamed to Bruiser and Tank respectively, and this was the first taste of those styles being playable in the Dragon Engine. Did they succeed in bringing them over? Fuck yes, they did. Bruiser feels just like Brawler in all the right ways, but with the inclusion of a sort of parry move where if you press the rush combo button right as the enemy attacks, you parry them, you can boost Kaito's combo speed for a bit and make it ridiculously broken. If you do this and then switch to Tank style, it carries over and feels like Beast style on crack, because you can just mow through enemies with such ease that it becomes laughable as they try to take down this giant ape of a man. Speaking of which, Tank style is just one of the best things ever, hands down, as Kaito can actually sprint while using it, absolutely destroy enemies, and it still has that heat action where you go from guarding to utterly decimating an enemy by just sitting down. And the combat theme is just perfect. Possibly my favorite Brute-style combat theme in any single RPG game. When you couple these things together, and with the only unfortunate downside being the lack of some kind of rush style, the combat and overall gameplay feel of Kaito in this DLC is absolutely fucking phenomenal. Also, why is it that you can change Kaito's outfit with a skill book, but you can't do that with Yagami? Actually, that was the thing in the original Judgment too. What the fuck? I truly can't think of anything worthwhile to complain about in the Kaito Files, and if you're gonna pick up Lost Judgment, which I absolutely recommend, you should definitely pick up the Kaito Files as well. Overall, Lost Judgment is really one of the best games in RGG's entire lineup, and the fact that it's one of the best-selling games in the series makes me so unbelievably happy. Whether or not we'll get another game in the Judgment lineup is uncertain, but the fact that Lost Judgment improved upon every single aspect of the first game really makes me wonder how much it can improve from here. Only time will tell, but for now, it's no mystery as to why these games are so good.